with the title RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots. Rossum is spelled by double S. Let me remind you that Čapek was one of the most popular and important writers in Czechoslovakia before the Second War. He was opposing the possibilities of invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Third Reich, and expecting that this is going to happen. He left his home in Prague, went to a summer cottage in the countryside, and he died there just before the invasion. And in spite of that, the German secret police, Gestapo, was hunting all over Czechoslovakia for Čapek, arresting his family. And that was the end of the life of Čapek. And unfortunately, we will not able to read anything he will probably have written after the Second War. So before I start talking about why I have picked up RUR for today's discussion, let me share the screen, and I hope this is gonna work without a major problem. Yes, this is the screen, and what you see here are a certain cover of the Čapek books I happen to have in Polish. One is the Factor of Absolute, the other is a book of Apocrypha, and a book which is similar in spirit to the RUR and in some sense preceded it. It's the book which for some reason was translated into English as A War with Newts. Newts is a kind of a reptile, amphibian reptile. Probably the better, particularly from the point of view of recent strange theories being so popular, should be called A War with the Reptiles. The book War with Newts is about the discovery made on some remote island on the Pacific island, if I remember correctly, of a particular kind of intelligent reptiles, and those newts. And they are very easily to teach, to perform initially a very simple activities usually done by humans. And initially they are used as a kind of a home servants, and they learn it very quickly to perform more and more elaborate activities, and eventually they are dominating all the labor all over the world. And at the one stage, they decided to rebel against the humans. And that is the end of the human civilization on the planet Earth. There is a particular part of that story which is very typical to Eastern Europe. So it's related to the fact that those reptiles, they use a minimum amount of water, but they are very good in drinking alcohol. But that's a part of the story. And in 1920, Čapek had written a play, as I said, RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots. And this is a page from the beginning of of the play, mentioning the characters performing in that play. That play had a long history of being shown in the theaters all over the world. And this is at the beginning. So let me tell you what is this story all about. The play is, there is an island, pretty remote island, relatively large, which is somewhere probably in the middle of Atlantic Ocean. So it might be the Azorean Islands or whatever. And the reason why we know that this is somewhere there is that the ship which carried the first important and the very important character of the play, a lady with the name Elena, arrives to the island from the French harbor in Havre. And on that island, a factory is located. And the factory is a factory of a company called Rosum's Universal Robots. And as I told you last time, this is the first time in the history where the word robot was used. So what is this factory manufacturing? The story is that there was the gentleman with the name Rosums, and this name is also a cliche for, in both Czech and also in Polish, a rozum means a human brain. So this was used for purpose by Chapin. And the island, on the island, there is an expedition, scientific expedition, which arrives at the island, and there are two rosums on it. It's an old rosum and the new rosums, the son. And the old rosum is a biochemist. And searching to the island, he discovers the particular substance, biological substance, and somehow he discovered that he can manufacturing a living organisms out of that substance by adding to it some chemical compounds and performing some kind of a physical operation on it. That is a secret of the Rosums, how he does it, which he writes in a kind of a folder, which is a treasury of that company. But old Robert is only interested in science, and the younger Rosum wants to make money out of this discovery. So he locks up his father in a luxurious laboratory on that island. And eventually, under the pressure, family pressure, old Rosums manufactured out of this biological substance found on that island, and using his, so to say, a blueprint, he starts to manufacturing humanoids, androids, or whatever the name you want to say, which Rosums called robots. And these are shaped like humans, at least from the outside, biological structures, which are able to perform very mundane activities of humans. So you see the similarity with the war with newts. And the factory grows and grows, and it not only produces more and more of those robots, but also it improves them. So very quickly, those robots become pretty good in various human activities. So the play starts that Mrs. Helene, who is a daughter of a president of the world, that is the word used in the play, arrives on the island because she is working for an organization which wants to bring the freedom to the robots, because our robots are all over the world already, and they have no rights. They are working in the factories, and in the same factory, there are working robots and the humans, and humans have all sorts of rights, and robots are deprived of all those rights. And they are not paid, and so forth. And Helene arrives on the island and meets a chief director of that company, certain gentleman Domin. And there is this dramatic first encounter of Mrs. Helene with the new, I should have used the word brand of the robots recently manufactured by the Rossum's Universal Robots, which can work as a secretaries and the lab technicians in the factory which makes robots. So this is the initial of robots, manufacturing robots, but the humans are essential because this blueprint, how the procedure of manufacturing these androids out of by this biological unknown substance is a secret kept by humans. And the story goes on, and eventually Elaine and this chief director of the factory, Domin, they fall in love, and she stays on the island. And a certain time passes, and the robots are considerably improved. And there are many other characters in there. There are business people who run the factory, and there is one individual who is a chief engineer of that company. And the robots are not only used now, after a few years, not only used as biological machines capable of performing a very elaborate activities, but they can also be used as soldiers. And a rebellion of robots all over the world starts. Well, as you see, this is the idea that these androids are not machines built out of the steel beams and chips, but biologically grown individuals, is something which has been picked up later on in many places. This is different than the robot which appears in the Metropolis by Fritz Lang. This robot in the Fritz Lang movie is like a C-3PO in Star Wars. It's a mechanical device which can do a limited number of thinking and activities. But as you remember from a Star Wars, these robots, contrary to what Asimov had written as 3 laws of robotics, can be also used as soldiers. So the reason why Asimov had written these laws of robotics is most probably because he had been aware of the Čapek play. He didn't like it, and he wanted to convince the other authors of the science fiction that whatever we do with the robots, they had to obey those 3 laws, not to be able to kill anybody, particularly not to be able to kill humans. So the rebellion of the robots in RUR progresses, and eventually they won the battle all over the world. And the last fortress of humans is the island on which the robots are produced. And the end of the play is dramatic because this remaining group of human workers in that factory, plus the management and owners, are preparing to fight the last battle of humanity on Earth. And when just before the battle starts, it's discovered that the Miss Elaine, who is now the wife of the chief CEO of that factory, Mr. Domin, had destroyed the blueprint of the production of the robots. And the robots can perform all activities of a human except of a procreation. They are not capable of having children. They have to be manufactured. Well, the battle starts, and the robots, particularly under the guidance of a pair of robots, one manufactured to look like a male and the other which is like a female, and they slain all the defenders of the last bastion of the humanity, and except of a chief engineer. There is a lengthy discussion whether he should also be executed, but it is not executed because the robots assemble is voting that this is also someone who works physically, because they have seen that chief engineer on a factory floor working as the robots by fixing things and so forth. So they save him, and they order him to continue to manufacture robots. But the production stops because the blueprint has been destroyed. The workers who knew what to mix with what to make that biological substance capable of sustaining the life, they have been killed. So the story is finished with the situation when the robots order this still surviving engineer to come back and start to work in the laboratory to learn how to manufacture, produce, or grow, depending on what is the proper word for it, of the new robots. And doing it, he finally find out that he is not capable of reconstructing, that this idea of all the Razums is lost. So he had to actually perform a vivisection, see how those robots are action. I mean, what is the internal structure of those robots by cutting them into pieces. And he doesn't want to do this. And in order to, in a certain sense, save himself from this barbarian act, he says that he had to do this vivisection on one of these male robots who have been chosen, those leaders, and kind of an Adam of the robots situation. And that's the end of the play. And there is lots of sophisticated discussion about the role of robots in the society. And if you will read that play, I mean, That's the first page is on it. This is when Elaine is finding out that the secretary of Domin is actually a robot, not the female. And if you read that, you find out that most of the issues which are now subject of discussion about what is the future of the artificial intelligence in our society and how the life on Earth will look if we will eventually delegate more than we have done already to the robots. And if we not only let the robots do the simple works like assembling the cars on the assembly line in a factory, I mean, essentially everything in a car is assembled nowadays by use of the robots. They are welding pieces of it, they are painting the cars, they install the parts in it. There is very little what the humans are doing in the car factories except of managing it and supervising what's happening. And if you look at these discussions nowadays, then you find out that most of that was already at least mentioned by Čapek in his remarkable play. The play had a long history. This is I mean, it was a theater play, so it had to be played on stage. And this is a picture of a stage set for the production of RUR in 1922 in Berlin. And this was done by Friedrich Keisler, one of the directors, very fashionable at the time. And the remarkable thing about that particular production is that this was a first stage, I mean, the theater production, which was broadcast on a kind of a television, which was already built and known at the time. We will be talking about the rule of a television later on today, but this was what was called a mechanical television. And it was just broadcast from one place to another, one in the same building. But anyway, that was as far as I know, either the first or one of the first transmissions of a kind of a television in which a dramatic stage performance was shown outside of that particular theater room. That play was shown in many places. The last time it was shown in Warsaw was in 1959. That is it's a page from the announcement of that play, and this was as you see, it was a premiere was on the 24th of November of 59, and it was played in a small stage of the Polish theater in Warsaw. This theater is still existing, but this is now the kind of a musical, low quality musical. And there is a list of the actors who were participating in the play. The main role of male of this CEO of the Rossum's factories was played by Marian Wyrzykowski, who was one of the leading Polish drama actors at the time. And this Mrs. Helene was played by the Justyna Kreczmarowa, also very famous Polish actress at that time. And one of those characters, Dr. Gall, was played by Jan Kobuszewski, and Jan Kobuszewski, who died last year, was one of the most popular comic actors, stage actors, and cabaret actors throughout the history of his life. So that was the RUR on the stage, and I show again here these 3 laws of robotics of Isaac Asimov, because they are tailored as contradict, as prevent the events which are subject to the RUR. The RUR was, quotation mark, plagiarized many times. Right after it was shown for the first time in 1922, there was a Russian director, and I was searching in vain in the internet for whether there is any trailer or any other information about what happened to that film. There was a film which had a completely different title, but the story which I was able to find was that in this Russian film from 1924, the RUR is mentioned in the way that the robots are wearing in the film, they're wearing the uniforms with the label RUR on the back. So anyway, the story of those is all the time in many of those quite serious movies about the future robotic. And if you have seen the movie by Ridley Scott, with Harrison Ford, about the android hunter, and that then these robots in the Scott film are also not mechanical devices; they are biological structures. So that is that's why I show again the Asimov story. And the Čapek play was also one of the very first science fiction books after the Wells, which were serious. They were not kind of stories about the non-existing creatures coming from somewhere and things like this. And I would like to mention one of the actually, as you will see, there is another person, but first one of the popular science fiction authors who had been writing stories which are not as simple-minded in some sense, science fiction stories like in the books of Asimov. And the name of this individual is Philip Jose Farmer. And there are 2 books shown here. The one book is The Other Log of a Phileas Fogg. As you might read it, there is a book by Jules Verne called In 80 Days Around the World, which is a story of the British gentleman Fogg, who had taken a bet with the members of his same club in London that he will be able to circle the earth in 80 days and come back to the club at a given particular day. And he bet a fortune on that he will manage. And the story is about the trip. And why I'm mentioning now the Farmer book is that this is a kind of a very specific literature. It is the 80 Days Around the World of Verne, rewritten, but carefully analyzed for a timeline of that book. And Farmer had found several mistakes, so to say, a lapse, missing time in this story, and had written another story with the same characters, which is sort of hidden underneath the original Jules Verne book. And the story is about that Phileas Fogg and his counterpart, a British Scotland Yard detective, who is following him all over the world to arrest him because he thinks that he is a criminal. And that they are actually, those characters are representative of two alien nations who had invaded the earth, and they are fighting a battle. And that battle happens only during this lapse of time in the story of Verne. So that is a really remarkably nice book to read, particularly if you have been reading original Verne book, or at least have seen one of many productions of the films 80 Days Around the World. But the other very important book by Philip and of Jose Farmer is called Riverworld. It's several books of it, 4 of those books, and they belong to the science fiction trend. Books where the creation of a civilization is discussed. How come that the civilization might come into existence? And the foundation by Isaac Asimov was one of those things. And the Riverworld is a completely different. It is a remarkable, I mean, it's also so much different as the book by Herbert, Dune, which, by the way, was recent remake, a movie remake, and perhaps it is still possible to watch it on in a cinema, and I'm sure it soon will be on one of this Netflix or HBO Go and other streaming portals. And anyway, the story of a Riverworld is incredible. There is a story that somewhere in the universe, there is a planet on which there is only one giant river, which goes all over the planet. It's very wide and very deep, and they are meat-eating, dangerous fish living in that river. And it is only a valley around that river which is inhabitable, and the rest are the very dangerous mountain. And what is remarkable, that all the humans and all the humanoids, including the Neanderthals, who have ever been living on Earth, are recreated in that valley. They are recreated in that valley, and independently of the time of their death, they are recreated as a 25-year-old individuals. And they are provided with the device, kind of a knapsack, which they connect to the, what is called in the book, gravestones, kind of a devices which charge those knapsacks and provide the food and clothing, some remarkable clothing, and what is remarkable also, the drugs for the people there. And the recreation is curious for the it is recreation without the time arrow. The time of life of those individuals is irrelevant. So, for example, one of the heroes of the second volume of the River World, which is called The Fabulous Riverboat, is Samuel Clemens. That is the original name of Mark Twain. And he has a friend and a bodyguard who happens to be Neanderthal. And the story is that someone or something is running that river, is running those gravestones. And a group of people under the guidance of a Samuel Clemens, who was initially in his life, Mark Twain, was a captain of a ship on the Mississippi, which is also the huge river, somewhat a model for that river on the River World. And they build up a boat and they go all over that river trying to find out where it goes and what is at the end of it. And the crew of that boat is a very mixture. One of the person on the crew is a Cyrano de Bergerac. There is a pilot of the kind of the dirigible they built there is Hermann Goering. And they, going all over the river, they meet the colonies of people who are also the very mixed, right? And the problem is that those people are fighting dramatically between each other, because if they get killed in those fights, then next day they are recreated somewhere along that river, but in a very different place. And the reason why Mark Twain goes all over that river is that Mark Twain's wife has died, and he was tremendously shocked by this fact. And he had written many kind of stories about how he suffers from the lack of that his wife is gone. And so Mark Twain thinks that since everybody was recreated, and once he learned that this is this recreation process going on, then perhaps his wife is also somewhere in that valley. So he goes all over the valley and the driving force for it is finding his wife. And the story is how the civilization is being rebuilt in this bunch of mixed up social structures. This is really remarkable book. And the other one is Dune. I'm not talking about the Dune because you can, as I said, watch it. Very nice. And slowly we are approaching the contemporary times. And after the cataclysm of the First War, it was a very short time when we went into the other disaster, a disaster of a Second War. And the Second War resulted in a tremendous civilization change. The periods between the First and the Second War and through the Second War was probably the fastest acceleration of our understanding of laws of nature we had in our history. The relativity theory, quantum mechanics, beginning of genetics, tremendous progress in technology, all that happened in that time. But there was one dramatical event in that development which have shed which caused that we are still having a tremendous problems in our society. And that was that the nuclear physics produce a nuclear bomb before we have mastered how to use a power of nuclear forces for a peaceful use. The fact that historically, the first nuclear device which harnesses a nuclear forces was a nuclear reactor built in Chicago by Enrico Fermi and Eugene Wigner is forgotten. And it is always said that this was the nuclear bomb, and this destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the nuclear bombs, that was the beginning of a nuclear era. And the years after the Second War, until basically today, is all the time the development of a civilization in the shadow of a nuclear disaster, which can be caused by the nuclear war. The nuclear war hasn't happened. Nobody used the nuclear weapons after the Second War. In a certain sense, it's the weapons not to be used. But we had a very few, 3 or 4 nuclear accidents in the nuclear powers. And the most dramatic was that in the Russian nuclear power plant in Chernobyl. But nevertheless, this danger of a nuclear war is hanging over us as a Damocles sword. And it was particularly dramatic in the 50s. And that also had the influence on art, and particularly in the movies. And this is the reason why I show that this is an announcement of a movie by American director Stanley Kubrick. And the film is called Dr. Strangelove. And the full title is Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. The film, you can see full film on the internet. And I believe I have I don't have it. For some reason, I was unable to find out the trailer for that movie. The story is that there is a conflict between Russians and Americans, and there is a stupid general who runs the military base which operates the nuclear bombers. And one of the scientists who is behind the idea that the nuclear war should be started against Russia is a French scientist, Dr. Strangelove. And this is a discussion who actually is a character depicted as Dr. Strangelove in that movie. And this is probably a mixture of these 2 individuals, and one of them is Edward Teller, very important physicist. If one of you is doing something in solid state physics, then you might have heard about the Young-Teller effect. And he is with his wife and the mathematician Metropolis. He is founding father of a implementation of a calculation method called the Monte Carlo method. And he was very great scientist. He never got the Nobel Prize because he was described as a warmonger, the person who was pushing for the war. The story is that the teller was a Hungarian by birth, similarly Eugene Wigner and John von Neumann. And they have been from the same school, actually, in Budapest. And he escaped the communist-run revolution in Budapest, in Hungary, right after the First War. And he then, being of a Jewish origin, he had to escape from Germany when the Hitler took over. And after the war, the Hungary fall into under the under the power of the communism, and the family of the teller, which was still living in Hungary and survived somehow the Second War, was persecuted now in Hungary by the communists. So he never stopped fighting against that division of the world, against this communist doctrine. And he was very much pushing for construction of a hydrogen bomb. And I'm not going to talk about this history, which is complicated. And the other individual who is added to that character of Dr. Strangelove is John von Neumann. John von Neumann, who was a congenial mathematician, one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, and the individual who had been responsible for invention of a way of constructing contemporary computers. All the computers except of the new computers like vector computers or parallel computers and possibly quantum computers, if they will be ever built, those devices are not operating under the rule of so-called von Neumann scheme. But all the laptops and the other computers, all these computers inside your telephones and so forth, they are built still following the von Neumann architecture of the computers. And he was the founding fathers of so many other applications of mathematics and computer sciences, like weather prediction, hydrodynamic simulations, and so forth and so forth. And von Neumann was badly sick in the 50s. He had a bone cancer and eventually died of it. So if you watch the movie, you realize that he is also, some of the features of a character of von Neumann are also in that character, Dr. Strangelove, in that movie. The movie was incredible. The main rule of it, there is an actor, British actor, Peter Sellers, who performed several characters in the play. It's a remarkable film, as actually many films of Stanley Kubrick. And that was the art which was politically active against the nuclear war. There were several also movies like this made in Europe, particularly in France. The very famous French actor were performing in the cheap production films which were against the nuclear war. And but I would like now to remind you about the other movie by the Stanley Kubrick, which was this movie which also changed the direction of a science fiction a bit. It's the film under the title 2001: Space Odyssey. And that is incredible movie which addresses the same issue as I mentioned was addressed in the books by Philip Jose Farmer or the Frank Herbert more recently, about how come that our civilization came to an existence, and how the life, thinking life, has come to existence. And these are two signs. This is this famous black obelisk at the beginning of our civilization. And this is a Stanley Kubrick in the stage set of the end of that movie. The 2000 and Space Odyssey is very often replayed by many televisions all over the world. So if you will have a chance and you haven't seen it, do so. This is a remarkable movie. So as you see, there is a lot of relation between the movies and the science fiction.
Well,
this is
people love your films, especially Travel.
This is a trailer.
Space Travel 2001. And but people are wondering that what is the meaning of last scene? You know, the old man were, you know, lying on the bed in a very old style house. And could you give us an answer?
I tried to avoid doing this ever since the picture came out, because when you just say the ideas, they sound foolish, whereas if they're dramatized, someone's guilty. But I'll try. I mean, the idea was supposed to be that he is taken in by godlike entities, creatures of pure energy and intelligence with no shape or form, and they put him in what I suppose you could describe as a human zoo, and to study him, and he spends his whole life passes from that point on in that room, and he has no sense of time. It just seems to happen as it does in the film, and they choose this room, which is a very inaccurate replica of French architecture, deliberately so inaccurate, because you know when.
Okay, and so that was the interview between the Stanley Kubrick and the Japanese journalist who wanted to understand the last stage of that movie. I think it's truly unnecessary to ask the authors what they think about their own what they do about it, their own structure. Just a second, there's somewhere the voice, the noise coming. So let me just check what is happening. It's this other voice comes from outside. I have no way of controlling it, so I apologize. But this science have penetrated the contemporary movies also in a different sense. And I would like now to discuss a contribution of a Polish director, Krzysztof Zanussi, who is an enormously accomplished movie director. He is one of the seniors of still acting movie directors, and among the movies he had produced, I picked up 3 of them, which are the movies relating science to the culture. And they are very different than the science fiction movies. They are addressing the issue how the science is influencing our life and how we should, and what is, quotation, moral or ethic use of science and the science development in our contemporary societies. And there are 3 films of it which are being shown here. The film is Structure of a Crystal, Illumination, and fairly recent film, Ether. I cannot resist the temptation of telling you that Krzysztof Zanussi is my colleague from a high school, and we are friends. And in that movie, Illumination, which was considerable part of it was shot on the old Physics Institute of the University of Warsaw, and many characters in that movie were played by real scientists of that time. And I had that privilege of also being one person in that movie. So I'm listed on that screen at the end of the film where the cast of actors is mentioned. So let me tell you very briefly what are these movies all about. A Structure of a Crystal is a story of 2 colleagues, 2 friends, physics students, who have been very close to each other during the university time. And after the university, one of them was end up as being a teacher in a village school. So he lives in the rather remote part of the country with his wife and children, and he lives there and he teaches, but he also does simple experiments, which we will now call of ecological character. He's very interested in the nature around it and how the laws of science, laws of physics are governing the organic part of our world, so to say. And the other makes a splendid scientific career. And at the one stage of the game, when he returns to Poland from a long stay abroad, he goes to visit his friend. And the movie is actually a lengthy discussion between these 2 individuals about the rule of science in their life and ethics of carrying the scientific work, scientific research, and how it, or whether it should be restricted by some other principles of a society or not. So this is a very, very interesting movie. And the second movie, The Illumination, is a philosophical movie. It is actually important that it starts from a definition of illumination, which is 3 minutes definition, given by, at that time still living, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, a Polish philosopher, Tatarkiewicz. And the story is about the young student who wants to study physics. And he comes to university, and learning and participating in the student's life on the physics department, he finds out that that the science does not play that role in our civilization as he thought it should. So the film is about the debate, in the internal debate of that particular young individual about the science and the life. And this young student was, the actor who performed that role wasn't actually a professional actor. He was a cameraman. And that was a fantastic role. But unfortunately, a few years afterwards, this Mr. Latavo was his name, he went as a cameraman with the Polish Himalaya exhibition, and he died during the exhibition on, if I remember correctly, on a K2. And that gives you a flavor of that the science is not so important. What are the experiments or what is the outcome of it? It's a discussion about the rule of science. And the third movie, called ITER, is a more modern story. It is a story about the end of the 19th century, where the people discover a substance that the ITER can be used as a tranquilizer and can be used for this, for example, during a surgery to put individuals asleep so they don't feel the process of surgery. And this is a story of a military medical doctor who uses the experiments with ITER not in the ethical way. And he's actually doing it because in some sense he has signed an agreement with the devil. And the whole movie is about the discussion about the scientists who, the science is here shown as those experiments with ITER and the devil. Actually, I like the movie. The movie was not well received by the critics, but in spite of the fact that the main role of it is there played is by also extremely good. I mean, all the characters in the Zanussi movies are perfectly directed. I mean, this is extremely well done films, and that is, everything is perfect. But I like that movie, except of the critics. I believe I have here, this is a picture of Krzysztof Zanussi. And then another branch of movie industry which deals with the science in the movies is the Star Wars. The George Lucas epopee, which essentially changed the way the science fiction movies are being made. And we had a special lecture about the Star Wars just before the Christmas, so I can skip that. And I would like to remind you the film which preceded Star Wars, which is the epopee, which is several movies which are still being made actually. This is called Star Trek. The first movie was made in 1960, and I wouldn't really discuss it, but I would like to, the reason why I show that transparency is that on the left side, you see the two characters in it. On the right, it's a commander of the battleship Enterprise, Commander Kirk. And that was played by an actor, William Shatner. And the other on the left is this alien, this other humanoid, Commander Spock, who is the way you can see that he is not a human race is if you look carefully on his ears. Why do I show that? Because William Shatner is still around. And what you see on the right is a launch of one of these private missiles going into the cosmos and offering rights of individuals who will pay a certain fee. This is the Blue Origin missile, and which is the child, so to say, of the Mr. Bezos, the owner of the Amazon. And Mr. Bezos was actually on the first flight of the Blue Origin. And on the third, I believe, flight of the Blue Origin, he invited William Shatner, who is 40, 60, he's now 80 years or so. And he took that trip to the orbits and back. And that was a kind of a nice story, that he plays so many installments of the Star Trek with many events. And the important thing of a Star Trek is that Star Trek predicted that the teleportation of humans will be possible. So there is a famous sentence in that movie when the captain or whoever travels to some different place than the spaceship, and they want to come back or go there, they go in a certain capsule, which looks like a cabin of a lift in my house, and says to one of the remaining engineers on the boat, beam me up. And that is a teleportation. Now we know that we can teleport the information and even some micro objects from the world, but that is the reason why I mentioned the Star Trek. And so that was as much as I wanted to say about the science in the part of a television industry. You have, of course, this enormous amount of the B-type movies about the monsters from the outer world and the invasion of the earth by the aliens and so forth and so forth. And honestly, I am not very interested in these kinds of movies, so I wouldn't be able to tell you anything very interesting except of a criticism of those movies. But 20s, as I mentioned already, talking about the RUR, stage production, there was a new art piece, type of art, which shows up in the second half of the 20th century particularly, and this is called the television. So we will be talking slowly for the rest of today's lecture and perhaps a little bit next week about the television. The television, the fact that it will be nice to have devices which can send the pictures from one place to another was discussed by, in the 19th century, by a Polish writer, one of the most important writers in the Polish literature, Bolesław Prus. This is a picture of Bolesław Prus. And if you will one day have a time and take, and if you will take a walk along a Krakowskie Przedmieście in Warsaw, going from, say, University of Warsaw towards the old town, then next, before you reached the Bristol Hotel, there's this these are these two plashy hotels on the Krakowskie Przedmieście. If you go towards the old town on the right side, there is a Bristol hotel, and on the left is European hotel. So just before the Bristol hotel, going downwards from the hill, is a street, Karowa Street. And before the Karowa Street, there is a little park next to the church. And in that park, there is a monument of Bolesław Prus. It's not a good sculpture, but it's there. So you can, and Prus was very, very important. He invented even the name for that way of showing a picture on the distance, called it telepatrzydło. Patrzeć means, in Polish, means to see something. So telepatrzydło means to see something on a distance. This is exactly an old Polish version of the word television. It's a translation. And he had the Prus, in addition of writing the stories, he also, and the books, he also had been having columns in the daily newspapers, in the weekly newspaper in Warsaw, and he writes a lot about the science. He was very involved in the popularization of science and modernization of the life of Poland, which at that time was not existing, which was divided by the Russian, Austrians, and Prussian empires. But the Prus had also been a remarkable author, and he had written many books. And one of these books, which, if it was written in French or English, will probably be considered as one of the world masterpieces. This book is called Lalka, a puppet. And this is a story about the beginning of a capitalism in Poland. The story is after the one of the uprising in Poland against the Russian Tsar in 1863. There was a motion inside of the country, much under the influence of a philosophical trend called positivism. That, well, we had enough of this attempts to get back our independence with the weapons in our hands. Perhaps it's time to start developing our industry, ourselves to join the tremendous technological and cultural revolution in the West of Europe at the time. And then perhaps that will be the better path toward regaining independence. So the story of Lalka is a story of one of the young members of the rebellion of '63 with the name Wokulski. And again, if you will be on the Krakowskie Przedmieście, if you will get to the essentially next to the Miodowa Street and cross to the square where there is this column with the Polish king of Swedish origin standing, then there is a store which is in the place which was the store of this character from Lalka, from the puppet, Mr. Wokulski. And Wokulski is a capitalist. He makes lots of money. He is no longer fighting. He makes money by actually, with a Russian friend, selling weapons for the Russian army and also some fighting with the Russian army in the deep Siberia group of people. And he makes money and he falls in love with the daughter of one of the rich aristocratic families. That's the reason of a word, of a title. But in addition, he is a scientist. And the important problem in that book is that Wokulski travels to Paris, where he is working with the French physicist with the name Geist to on many subjects, and one of them is to make a metal which will be lighter than air, and in that way to be able to create the flying machines, which will be different from the balloons. And the book is having its end, which is on which the Wokulski is disappearing. He is rejected by aristocratic part of society, in spite of the fact that he spends a fortune on buying them out of troubles. And it's not clear, actually, what happens to the Wokulski. And one of the interpretation is that he blown up himself with the old castle. And that is the sense that there is a sentence of the old doctor Schumann, who, when he learns that Wokulski had disappeared, says that while he is dead, he is covered by the debris of the feudalism in that castle, which was blown up into pieces. And the other interpretation is that he had blown up that castle in order to hide the fact that he went forever, for the last years of his life, to Paris to work all time with the Geist and to do the science. And there are lots of interesting discussions in that book about how these discoveries made at this time in the world are being seen by this agriculture-based civilization of the divided Poland at that time. So that is a very interesting and it is the reason why when I'm talking about it is about this television was discussed by Mr. Prus, and this is actually there were also a series of a performance in the early Polish television about based on this article, these stories of Prus. There is a Telepatrzydło #1, Telepatrzydło #2, Telepatrzydło #3, and Telepatrzydło on the base of a chronicles which he had written. So there were performances, and the director of those performances in early days of Polish television was a very famous theater director, Adam Hanuszkiewicz, who actually had invented a television the drama theater in the television. This early 60s, this was a time where every Monday, there's a Polish custom that the drama theaters and the museums are closed on Monday. They used to be closed on Monday. And that allowed the actors from the big and main theaters in Poland to perform a television in the evening. There was no reason why they should skip the evening in the theater, then they could have performed a television. And those drama plays in Polish television at the time, on Monday, they were live. They were not recorded. the early recording of a television called Ampex was of a very poor quality. So there are still some recording of this place, which occasionally you can see on the culture channel of a television, and they are really of a bad quality. So there was this drama theater on Monday, and on Thursday afternoon, there was a theater, also television theater called Cobra. And that was criminal stories and detective plays, mostly the plays based on the Agatha Christie books. So that was the television and the focus. This is a short story of the Proust. In 1875, he purchased himself a sewing machine. In 91, he learned how to ride the bicycle, and he bought the bicycle. It was so expensive that he had to take a bank loan to pay for the bike. And in 97, he purchased a typewriter. And that was a typewriter which already was made in Poland by a company called Gerlach. And Gerlach is sort of still existing company. It was famous for making a kitchen utensils, and it's now back in a business of selling Chinese-made pots and pans and so forth. And in 1908, he bought himself a Kodak, the camera. And this is what he writes about. And one of the new and at the same time scientific inventions is a photography. Her father is optics, mother is a chemistry, and painting and artistic drawing played the role of the nanny. So as you see, he was very interested in technological development. And when the first electric trams were made operational in Poland in 88, he wrote this story about it in the newspaper, when the huge furniture-like carts without horses first showed, the audience focused on the sidewalks as densely as during the passage of the deceased Persian Shah. And the first time people were allowed, people pushed themselves like lottery tickets. And for a few days, it belonged to the formation. If anyone could say about himself, I took an electric tram. All right, so that's about the Proust. And now let's talk about the television. And the television has a long history. The first truly working television device was built by John Lodge Bird around 1920. And that was a mechanical television. And this is a scheme how it works. There was a light shown on the individual which scatter from objects or a person and goes into the rotating wheel, which had a little holes made on a spiral. So with each revolution, it picks up a light from a different point on the object on which the line was shining. And that passing through the hole in a disc beam gets to the photoelectric cell and sends the electric impulse through devices, which were then sent via the radio waves to the pickup antenna. And the pickup antenna was initiating a photovoltaic effect, which was emitting the light. And that blink of light was shining on the rotating wheel, which has the same structure as on the other side of the communication channel. And therefore, the blinks of light were going into the observer. But of course, it was much smaller. So the initial devices had a magnifying glass through which the picture was observed. So that was the mechanical television. And for example, this first television production show of a production of RUR in Berlin, which I mentioned, was done by the mechanical devices. And the mechanical television devices with improved receiving sites, so no longer a magnifying glass was needed, was actually acting until the 50s. And the first broadcast station of a television in the United States, they were the mechanical television station. There were various experiments with it. The tremendous progress was when people will figure out that instead of this rotating wheels and so forth, they can use what was called a brown cathode ray tube. This was a purely electronic device. There was a cathode which was emitting the beam of electrons, which were going through the vacuum in the tube and was hitting the screen, and which was the net, which was having a positive potential. So the beam was accelerated, and it hit on the net, the site on the grid. And next to it, there was a luminophore. So the blink, the voltage on that grid point caused this part of a luminophore next to it shine. And then if the beam was deflected in X and Y direction by two separate electric coils, which changed the voltage according to the signal, then the beam was going over the coil net, that grid, and therefore it was illuminating only those points which have been sent to it, so to say, via this mechanical device. And that was much better than this wheels and magnifying glasses. The other progress was that it was invented by Mr. Zworykin, that who, by the way, instead of the name was American, to do the color brown tube. And there were many developments of a television which were going in very much independent in Europe and in the United States. There was pretty little of a similarity in these activities. And for example, in Europe, the main impulse for expanding a television was a Berlin Olympic in 1936. This was this complete disaster that the world community had allowed the Olympics to be staged in the city run by the Nazis. The labels on the shops and public places, Jude Raus, was washed out, not really very carefully, for the Olympics. And the world have been enjoying the sport performances due to this enormous expansion of a business of the Olympics, for which the Nazi government spent a fortune, and particularly because this was the first sport event which was shown on at least in Berlin, on a kind of a television sets, which were available. There were very few of them, but for example, this was a first counterpart to the movie. And surely also the Berlin Olympics was a tremendous change in the movie industry for a very, incredibly intelligent and artistically genuine lady, Mrs. Leni Riefenstahl, had made a fantastic movie about the Olympics. Many ideas how to show the sport events have been invented by the Leni Riefenstahl for that movie. Leni Riefenstahl had been a Nazi followers, and after the war, he had disappeared from the movie industry, and she went to Africa, and at the age of 70, she got the license for skin diving, and she made several, again, incredibly artistically fantastic movies about the underwater life in the Red Sea. So this is Leni Riefenstahl is an example of how you can sell your own incredible talents to the devil. It's you cannot see the feature movies by Leni Riefenstahl. They are not shown, but the main thing was this Olympics movie, and parts of the Olympic movie is still being played on a television network. And so this is a short history of how television developed. The first broadcast was July 2nd, 1928. It was Mr. Jenkins, who was one of also the inventors of a mechanical television, had opened up, had made the truly the first television station. Slightly earlier, a company with the American label WRGB had broadcast a program called The Queen's Messenger. And the WRGB is the oldest still broadcasting TV station in the United States. And the Queen Messenger, when it was aired, there were at most 4 television sets outside of the building of the company on which that could have been seen. The 1935-36 is the Deutsche Rundfunk, the German company, which prepared the programs for the Olympics. In 41, there was a first, there's a team missing, I'm sorry. There was a first commercial shown on the television, and that was a commercial for a Bulova watch, Swiss one, which, and it lasted all 10 seconds compared to today's commercials. And in 46, the color television were already, they were still mechanical. They have been something which was called the War of Color started. The broadcasting company CBS and electronic company RCA, Radio Corporation America, have fought the war, which system of a color television should be accepted as a general. And that is something very similar to what had happened later on for another reason. In the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, a color television becomes generally available and cheap, so the people could have it at homes. Then then the eastern part of the Europe, the Soviet Union and the communist-dominated countries in Eastern Europe and France use another color television system than the rest of the world. The reason was that the French invented their own color television system, SECAM, instead of the other, which was called PAL. And the French were not eager to give up, so they sold the license to the Eastern world, and the television set in East were SECAM one. they had the same audio, but they had shifted lines in the receivers. So if you had the television set with the PAL, you couldn't see the second movies and other way around. And the point of the political point in East Germany was at the time to prevent the East German citizens from watching the West German movies. West Germany using a PAL system, and the East Germany and the old communist bloc were using a second movie system, second television system. And therefore, I mean, but that was quickly overcome by the engineers who had invented a tiny electronic gadget which built into the second television set allowed to watch you had to switch from PAL to a little switch from PAL to second. And when I bought once a color television set, which were much cheaper in Germany, West Germany, then the people in the store already asked me, "Are you going to use it in Germany, or are you taking it with you to Poland?" I said, "I take it with me to Poland." And they said, "Okay, then come back in 3 days, because we will have our technician to build up into your TV set this little device which changed the system." So there was this war going on, and after 1989, when the SECAM had disappeared from our world, and we all have now the PAL system. There was also the similar problem with the ultra short wavelength radio, which had been operating in the Eastern world on the other wavelengths than in the West. But that was also being fixed by the engineers. I mean, there were lots of little places in Warsaw where for a few zlotys, the engineers were building up the device which allow you to listen to the particularly portable radio or radio in a car from the one system to another. In the 1949, there were already 98 television stations which were operating in the United States. In 1951, the first sitcom, I Love Lucy, was shown on a television. And in 1952 was a really a turning point. The Bob Hope, he was a comedian, the most famous stage and television later and movie comedian, American comedian, have moved his program, weekly program, from one of the syndicated radio station to the television. And at that time, there were almost 20 million of TV sets in the United States. In 1960 was a seminal year for a first political debates, four political debates between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon happened on the television. This was so remarkable change in the politics as the 1922, when the Pittsburgh company, TWK, radio company owned by Mr. DeForest, the engineer who invented the pentode, the 5 electrodes electronic tube, sent up the first coverage of a presidential election through the radio. And as you know, Kennedy became a president due to this political debates. In 1964, about 78 million of people watched the Beatles being interviewed on that Sullivan show, one of these evening shows on the television. And I end up the history in 1969, where, and this is a terrible mistake, it should be capital A and G at the end. Neil Armstrong, first step on the moon, was transmitted via the television to the old television receivers. At that time, there were all of the television sets in Poland, and we were with my wife on the vacations, and we walk to a house of people who had a television set in that place in the evening, and we spend the whole night waiting for a transmission in there. The room in which the television set was located was completely full, where I mean the people were standing through all the night to be allowed to, the children in the first row, the elderly people in the chairs, and the rest of the people, and we watched the Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. 4 years later, in 1973, I was a single person in the television hall of a student house belonging to the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, watching the last landing of the Apollo mission on the moon. In the 4 or 5 years, the moon travels from something which caused the world to stop breathing, become completely uninterested. And well, maybe nowadays the Blue Origin and the Mr. Musk movie are of the same interest. All right, so that was the television. And that brings me to a moment of the particular cultural and scientific phenomenon, which goes under the name the ascent of man. And that is, this is a serial, 13-program serial, recorded by BBC and broadcast in 1973. And that series of films was called The Ascent of a Man. And we will start next week with the trailer of that series. The serial was the first popularization of science serial shown on the television. And the author of it and the person who was a presenter of it was Jacob Bronowski, a Polish-born British mathematician, philosopher, and a world television celebrity. And we will be discussing the ascent of a man next week. But let me just tell you that some of you might have watched now popular science programs, ecological and biological, by Attenborough. And these, as many other scientific popularization programs, are essentially following the system invented, the way of showing it, invented by the Bronowski. It's extremely difficult to invent the other way of providing a public with another way of perceiving the subject of a popularization science that it was invented by the Jakub Bronowski. Bronowski was born in Łódź. It's a town on the west of Warsaw. And in the 20s, he had emigrated with his family to Germany, to Berlin. And before the Nazi took power, they went to Britain, to London. And the remarkable story of Bronowski is that he was a professor of mathematics at the University of Hull. He had been one of the inventors of the mathematics of shape, and very important contribution to this mathematics has been done by Bronowski. The war had started. He joined the army, and he was planning this aerial bombing. He was in a team of mathematicians and the military who had been planning the aerial bombing of the German military and also not military places during the Second War. And after the war, he was sent by the British Army to Japan to carry the information, to get the information about the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And after that, he quit. And he went and became a mathematician for the coal board, the institution which was planning a distribution of a coal in the post-war Britain. And he invented a lot of mathematics of what is nowadays called logistics. And then he became a major popularizer of science. And all the time he was writing philosophical books, but all that we discuss in a greater detail next week. So let me stop sharing the screen. Oh, I would like to. Stop sharing the screen, fine. And we will start next week with talking about the Ascent of Man, and I show you the trailer of that film, of that serial, and we discuss a lot of other things. So thanks for being with me today. Stay healthy, avoid catching the Omicron. And if you haven't been vaccinated, go and do this as soon as possible. And let's see each other next week in not worse stage of the health than today. Thank you and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.